The dust of Fallow Ridge had a particular taste to it, bitter as spent gunpowder, dry as old bones. Eleanor Hayes knew that taste well by now, had been swallowing it for 3 days since the stagecoach left her at the edge of this forgotten town, with nothing but a carpetbag and a promise that turned to ash. The promise had been simple enough: travel west, meet Samuel Morrison, marry him, tend his homestead. She'd sold everything back in Ohio for the fair, clutching his letters that spoke of good soil and clear water. But Samuel Morrison was nowhere to be found, just an empty plot of land and townsfolk who shrugged when she asked after him. Been gone 2 months, they said. Maybe 3. Now she stood with the rest of the crowd in the town square, drawn by the same morbid curiosity that pulled people to hangings and horse races. But this was neither. This was something else entirely. The iron cage sat in the center of the square like a monument to fear itself. 8 feet tall, 6 feet wide, bars thick as a man's wrist. Inside it, a figure sat motionless against the back bars, knees drawn up, head lowered. Even from 20 feet away, Eleanor could see the heavy shackles on his wrists, the chains that bound him to the cage floor. "How long's he been in there?" a newcomer asked. 3 weeks come Tuesday, someone answered. "Sheriff Bradley's keeping him till the circuit judge comes through." "What'd he do?" "Killed a man up in the mountains, maybe more than one. They say he went wild after—" The speaker stopped, glanced around nervously. "Well, after what happened to his family." Eleanor pushed closer through the crowd. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and she could see how it must bake that iron cage, turn it into an oven. The man inside hadn't moved, hadn't even lifted his head at the sound of voices. His clothes were torn, dusty, hanging loose on a frame that suggested former strength now worn down by captivity. Dark hair fell past his shoulders, matted and unkempt. "Why keep him like an animal?" Eleanor found herself asking aloud. The woman beside her snorted. "Because that's what he is. You didn't hear the stories. Found him living in a cave, they did. Hadn't spoken a word in years. When they tried to bring him in peaceful-like, he fought like a wildcat. Took 6 men to subdue him. But what was his crime exactly?" "Crime!" The woman's voice rose. "They found bones in that cave, human bones, and the Garrett family that went missing last winter? Their wagon was found not a mile from where he was living." Eleanor studied the caged man more carefully. His stillness wasn't that of an animal. It was too controlled, too deliberate. Animals paced, animals snarled. This man sat like a statue carved from grief itself. "Move along, folks," Sheriff Bradley's voice boomed across the square. "Nothing more to see here. You've all had your look." The crowd began to disperse, but Eleanor remained. She'd seen cruel men before. Her father had been one, her late husband another. They had a certain look about them, a hardness in the eye, a quickness to violence. This man had none of that. What she saw instead was something broken, something that had given up. The sheriff noticed her standing there. "Ma'am," I said, "move along." "Is he fed?" Eleanor asked. "What? Is he given food?" "Water." Sheriff Bradley's face reddened. "Course he is. We're not barbarians. Now get going before—" "I'd like to speak with him." The sheriff laughed, a harsh sound. "Lady, that man hasn't spoken a word since we brought him in. Won't even tell us his name. Besides, it ain't safe." "He's in a cage," Eleanor pointed out. "How much harm can he do?" "You'd be surprised. Last person who got too close nearly lost a finger." But Eleanor was already walking toward the cage. Behind her, she heard the sheriff curse and follow. The man in the cage didn't look up as she approached, didn't acknowledge her presence even when she stopped just outside arm's reach. "Sir?" she said softly. "Nothing." "I asked you what was his crime," Eleanor said, turning back to the sheriff. "His actual crime, not stories about bones or missing families. What evidence do you have?" Sheriff Bradley's jaw worked. "He killed Tom Garrett, found him standing over the body, blood on his hands. Was it self-defense? Don't matter. Tom Garrett was a respected man in these parts, had a wife, 3 children. This creature took him from them." Eleanor looked back at the caged man. A thin line of dried blood ran from his temple to his jaw, an old wound poorly tended. His hands, she noticed, bore the scars of hard labor, not violence. Carpenter's hands, maybe, or a blacksmith's. What will happen to him? Judge'll hang him most likely, though some folks are calling for worse. The sheriff spat tobacco juice into the dust. Tom Garrett had a lot of friends. Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach. She'd come west to escape one kind of injustice, only to find another. Her husband had been killed over a land dispute, shot in the back by men who wanted his claim. The law had done nothing then, said there wasn't enough evidence, though everyone knew who'd done it. Now here was law keeping a man in a cage like a beast, waiting to hang him on the word of frightened townsfolk. She reached into her carpet bag, fingers finding the small cloth bundle she'd carried all the way from Ohio. Inside was the last thing of value she owned, her wedding ring. She'd kept it not out of sentiment, but as insurance, something to sell if times got desperate. Times were desperate now, just not in the way she'd imagined. "Sheriff Bradley," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "I want to make you a proposition." "Ma'am?" Eleanor pulled out the ring, let it catch the light. Gold gleamed dully through the dust. "This man needs someone to speak for him, someone to take responsibility." "What are you talking about?" She turned to face the crowd that had gathered again, drawn by the spectacle of her approaching the cage. "You all believe in justice, don't you? In the law?" Murmurs of agreement, some confused, some hostile. "Then you must believe in mercy too, in redemption." Eleanor held up the ring. "I'm offering to marry this man, take responsibility for him. If he's truly the monster you say, then I'll be the one to suffer for it. But if he's not—" The silence that followed was deafening. Then someone laughed, a harsh, disbelieving sound. Others joined in, and soon the square rang with mockery. "You lost your mind, woman? Must be touched by the sun. Marry that thing? You'd be dead before morning." But Eleanor stood her ground. She'd stood against worse. Her father's fists, her husband's death, the long journey west that had ended in abandonment. She looked at the caged man again and saw his head had lifted slightly, just enough that she could glimpse his eyes through the fall of dark hair. They were gray as winter storms, and held a pain so deep it took her breath away. "I'm sound of mind," she said loudly, addressing the sheriff but speaking for the crowd. "And I know what I'm offering. This man needs someone to vouch for him, or you'll hang him based on fear and suspicion. I'll take that responsibility." "You don't even know his name," Sheriff Bradley protested. "Do you?" Eleanor countered. When the sheriff didn't answer, she pressed on. "You've kept him caged for 3 weeks without trial, without even knowing who he is. Where I come from, that's not justice. Where you come from don't matter. This is Fallow Ridge, and we do things—" "I know how you do things." Eleanor's voice turned hard. "I've seen it before. My husband was murdered by men who did things their way. The law looked the other way because the killers were respected men with friends." She met the sheriff's gaze steadily. "Is that what's happening here?" The crowd grew restless, ugly. Someone shouted for her to leave town. Others voiced cruder suggestions. But Eleanor had committed now, had chosen her path the moment she'd seen the truth in those gray eyes. She stepped closer to the cage, close enough that if the man wanted, he could reach through the bars and grab her. He didn't move. "Sir," she said softly, speaking only to him now, "I don't know your story. I don't know what brought you to this place, but I know injustice when I see it, and I know loneliness too." She held up the ring where he could see it. "I'm offering you a chance. It's not much. I've got no home, no family, nothing but the clothes on my back and the promise of land that might not even exist. But I'm offering it freely." The man's eyes found hers and held. In them, she saw not madness or violence, but a weariness that matched her own. Slowly, so slowly, she almost missed it. He nodded. Eleanor turned back to Sheriff Bradley. "There, he's agreed. Now open this cage." "I can't just—" "Yes, you can." Eleanor's voice carried across the square. "You've held him without trial, without evidence except hearsay and fear. I'm offering to take responsibility for him, to remove him from your town. Unless you plan to explain to the circuit judge why you denied a woman her legal right to marry?" The sheriff's face went through several shades of red. The crowd pressed closer, voices rising in anger and disbelief. But Eleanor stood firm. the ring in her hand catching the last rays of sun like a promise. "You're insane," Sheriff Bradley declared, but Eleanor could see uncertainty creeping into his eyes. The crowd pressed closer, their hostility palpable in the dust-thick air. "Perhaps," Eleanor replied calmly. "But insanity isn't illegal. Neither is marriage." She raised her voice to carry across the square. "Unless the good people of Fallow Ridge have decided to abandon all pretense of law." "The law?" A man pushed forward, tall, well-dressed, with the bearing of someone used to being obeyed. "That creature murdered my brother. Tom was checking his trap lines, innocent as a lamb, when this animal attacked him." "Were you there, Mr. Garrett?" Eleanor asked. The man's face darkened. "I didn't need to be. We found Tom's body not 50 yards from where this savage made his den, blood still on his hands. And did anyone see what happened? Any witnesses?" "Witnesses?" Garrett laughed bitterly. "In the mountains, the only witness is sitting in that cage, and he won't talk, won't even defend himself. What innocent man refuses to speak?" Eleanor turned back to the caged man. He had raised his head fully now, watching the exchange with those storm-gray eyes. There was intelligence there, she realized. He understood every word. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "grief takes our voices. Sometimes pain runs so deep that words become meaningless." She thought of her own months of silence after James died, how she'd moved through each day like a ghost, unable to speak of what had happened, unable to make others understand the injustice of it. "Grief," another voice from the crowd. A woman this time, her face pinched with fear. "What grief could excuse what we found in that cave? The bones, the belongings of travelers who'd gone missing?" "Old bones," someone else corrected. "Years old," the sheriff said. "Could have been anyone's." "And the belongings?" the woman insisted. "The Garrett family's wagon?" Eleanor kept her eyes on the prisoner. "Sir," she said gently, "I need to know. Did you harm the Garrett family, the women and children?" For a long moment, nothing. Then, slowly, the man shook his head. The chains rattled with the movement, a sound like distant thunder. "He's lying." Garrett surged forward, but two men held him back. "Don't listen to him." "He didn't speak," Eleanor pointed out. "He answered my question with a gesture, and I choose to believe him." She turned to Sheriff Bradley. "You found old bones in a cave. You found a wagon. You found this man near a body. That's all circumstantial. Where I come from, we call that insufficient evidence." "Where you come from doesn't matter." The sheriff's patience had worn thin. "This is our town, our law. Then your law should protect all men equally." Eleanor's voice rose with conviction. "Even those who can't or won't speak for themselves, especially them." She reached into her carpetbag again, pulling out a small leather folder. "These are my papers. Eleanor Hayes, widow, formerly of Coshocton County, Ohio, 27 years old, of sound mind and body. I have the legal right to marry, and I'm exercising it." The crowd had grown larger now, drawing people from the saloons and shops. She could see curiosity beginning to mix with the hostility, heard whispers spreading through the gathering. "She's the one Morrison was supposed to marry, traveled all this way alone." Must be desperate or crazy. Eleanor let them talk. She'd learned long ago that people would think what they wanted regardless of truth. What mattered was action. "Sheriff," she said, "I'm not asking you to free him unconditionally. I'm offering to take responsibility to remove him from your town. If he proves dangerous, it'll be on my head. But if he's innocent, if you hang an innocent man because fear made you see a monster where there was only grief, that blood will be on your hands. And on the hands of everyone here who stood by and let it happen." Sheriff Bradley wavered. She could see it in the way his hand moved unconsciously to his badge, the way his eyes darted between her, the crowd, and the caged man. "Even if I agreed," he said finally, "we'd need a minister, and Reverend Walsh won't perform a wedding for him. Then we'll make do without one. A civil ceremony. You have the authority as sheriff." "I won't be party to this madness." "Then I will." A new voice spoke up, and the crowd parted to reveal an elderly man leaning heavily on a walking stick. Eleanor recognized him as the town's elderly judge, Patrick O'Brien. "Judge O'Brien," Sheriff Bradley straightened. "You can't seriously consider—" "I've been watching from my window," the judge interrupted. "Listening to this young woman speak more sense than I've heard in this town for months." He limped forward, his keen eyes studying Eleanor. "You truly wish to marry this man, knowing nothing about him except what fear and rumors say?" "I know he's been caged for 3 weeks without trial," Eleanor replied. "I know he's been condemned without speaking in his own defense. And I know—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I know what it's like to lose everything and have no one believe your truth." Judge O'Brien nodded slowly. "And you, young man," he addressed the prisoner, "do you consent to this marriage?" The man in the cage lifted his shackled hands, chains clanking. With effort, he pressed his palms together and inclined his head, a gesture that might have been prayer or acceptance or both. "He consents," the judge declared. "Sheriff, open the cage. Judge O'Brien, open it, Bradley. Or explain to the circuit court why you held a man without formal charges and denied him the opportunity for legal matrimony." The sheriff's face was thunderous, but he reached for his keys. The crowd surged backward as he approached the cage, as if the prisoner might burst free and attack them all. "Stand back," Sheriff Bradley ordered the prisoner. "Any sudden moves, and I'll shoot you where you stand." The man moved slowly to the far side of the cage, hands visible, head slightly bowed. Eleanor noticed how he moved, not like an animal, but like someone who had learned to make himself unthreatening, to take up as little space as possible. The lock clicked open. The door swung wide with a creak of protesting metal. "Out," the sheriff commanded. "Slow and easy." The prisoner emerged into the fading daylight, and Eleanor got her first clear look at him. Taller than she'd expected, broad-shouldered despite his time in captivity. His clothes were indeed torn and filthy, but underneath the grime, she could see they had once been well made. His feet were bare, scarred from walking on rough ground, but it was his face that held her attention. Angular features marked by hardship, a strong jaw covered in weeks of beard, and those gray eyes that seemed to hold storms. "The shackles stay on," Sheriff Bradley announced, "until you're out of my town." Eleanor stepped forward, close enough now to smell the cage stink on him, the sweat and fear and resignation. She held up her wedding ring. "I, Eleanor Hayes, take this man as my lawful husband," she said clearly, "to have and to hold for better or worse from this day forward." Judge O'Brien cleared his throat. "And do you—" He paused, frowning. "What is your name, son?" The prisoner's mouth opened slightly, then closed. His throat worked as if trying to remember how to form words. Finally, he shook his head. "He can't speak," Eleanor said. "Or won't. Does it matter? For legal purposes? Then I'll name him." Eleanor looked into those gray eyes. "Is that acceptable? May I give you a name for the law's sake?" The man studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. Eleanor thought of the storm in his eyes, the mountain cave where they'd found him, the sorrow that seemed to emanate from him like heat from sun-baked stone. "Stone," she said. "Jacob Stone. Is that acceptable?" Another nod, this one perhaps carrying a hint of bitter amusement. "Then do you, Jacob Stone, take this woman as your lawful wife?" Judge O'Brien asked. The man— Jacob now raised his shackled hands again. With clumsy fingers he pointed to Eleanor, then to himself, then pressed his palms together once more. "I'll take that as consent," the judge said dryly. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I pronounce you man and wife." He turned to Eleanor. "God help you, young woman. You may have just signed your own death warrant." Eleanor took the ring she'd been holding and reached for Jacob's hand. He flinched at first, then held still as she slipped it onto his finger. The ring was too small, would only fit on his smallest finger, but he curled his hand to keep it in place. "Now get out of my town," Sheriff Bradley growled. "Both of you, and if he so much as— We're going." Eleanor turned to address the crowd one last time. "I hope you all sleep well tonight, knowing you would have hanged a man who couldn't speak to defend himself." She picked up her carpet bag and started walking toward the edge of town. Behind her, she heard the shuffle of bare feet on dust, the clink of chains. Jacob Stone, her husband now, strange as that seemed, followed at a distance, as if unsure whether this freedom was real or just another form of cage. At the town's border, where the buildings gave way to open country, Eleanor stopped and turned. The crowd had followed them, maintaining a safe distance, watching to ensure they truly left. Sheriff Bradley stood at the front, hand resting on his pistol. "The shackles," Eleanor called out. "You said they come off when we leave town." "When you're well away," the sheriff corrected. "Send them back with the next traveler you meet, or I'll hunt you both down." Eleanor felt anger rise in her throat but swallowed it. There would be time to deal with shackles later. For now, they needed distance between themselves and Fallow Ridge's version of justice. She looked at Jacob, standing there in the dying light with chains on his wrists and her ring on his finger. "Can you walk? We need to put miles between us and them before dark." He nodded and gestured down the road with his bound hands. The message was clear: lead the way. Eleanor shouldered her carpet bag and started walking. The road stretched ahead into gathering darkness, toward mountains that rose like broken teeth against the sky. Behind them, the town of Fallow Ridge watched and whispered, already turning her act of mercy into legend, the kind of story told in saloons to make men shake their heads and women clutch their children closer. But Eleanor didn't look back. She'd made her choice in front of witnesses, traded her last valuable possession for a man's freedom. Now came the harder part: learning who she'd actually married, and whether her instincts about the gentle sorrow in his eyes had been right, or whether the town's fears would prove justified after all. The ring on Jacob's finger caught the last of the sunlight as they walked, a small circle of gold binding them together in the most unlikely of unions. Two strangers, two griefs, heading into the wilderness with nothing but hope and determination to guide them. Behind them, Fallow Ridge disappeared into the dust and gathering dark, taking its cages and cruelties with it. Ahead lay only the unknown road and the silent promise of something that might, with luck and courage, grow into understanding. They walked until the last traces of daylight bled from the sky, following a wagon trail that wound between scrub brush and scattered boulders. Eleanor's feet ached in her worn boots, and her carpet bag grew heavier with each mile, but she didn't complain. Behind her, Jacob's chains clinked softly with each step, a rhythm that reminded her they were still not truly free. When full darkness made the trail treacherous, Eleanor stopped near a cluster of juniper trees that offered some shelter from the wind. "We'll camp here," she said, setting down her bag with relief. Jacob stood uncertainly at the edge of the small clearing, his silhouette barely visible against the stars. He hadn't come closer than 10 feet to her since they'd left town, maintaining that careful distance like a beaten dog unsure of kindness. "You can sit," Eleanor said gently. "I'm going to gather some firewood." He shook his head sharply and moved toward the surrounding brush. Despite the shackles hampering his movements, he began collecting dried branches, working with an efficiency that spoke of long practice. Eleanor watched, surprised, as he arranged the wood with precise care, larger pieces at the base, kindling properly placed for airflow. From her carpet bag, she pulled out the matches she'd bought in Fallow Ridge with nearly her last coins. But before she could offer them, Jacob was already at work. He'd found 2 suitable stones and struck them together with his bound hands, sending sparks into a small nest of dried grass he'd prepared. It took several tries with the chains limiting his movement, but soon a tiny flame caught and grew. "You've done this before," Eleanor observed. He glanced up at her, then back to the growing fire, feeding it carefully until warmth began to push back the desert night's chill. Eleanor unpacked what little she had, a blanket, some hardtack and dried beef, a dented canteen half full of water. She laid these out between them, an offering of sorts. Jacob studied the meager supplies, then rose and disappeared into the darkness without a sound despite his chains. Fear flickered through her. Had he run? Had the townspeople been right about his wild nature? But before panic could take hold, he returned, carrying something in his cupped hands. He knelt by the fire and showed her prickly pear fruits, carefully harvested despite the thorns. Using a flat stone, he scraped away the spines with practiced movements, then offered her the cleaned fruit. Eleanor bit into one cautiously and found it sweet, the juice a blessing after hours of dusty travel. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and prepared more, his movements economical, focused. She noticed how he handled the knife-sharp spines, not carelessly, but with the patience of someone who'd learned to work around obstacles. They ate in silence, sharing the hardtack and beef, the cactus fruit for dessert. Jacob took only small portions until Eleanor pushed more toward him. Even then, he ate slowly, as if remembering how. When the meal was finished, Eleanor pulled out her sewing kit. "Those clothes are falling apart," she said. "I'm no great seamstress, but I can at least mend the worst tears." Jacob looked down at himself as if seeing his state for the first time. He plucked at his shirt, found a rent that exposed most of his side, and something like embarrassment crossed his features. "May I?" Eleanor held up needle and thread. He hesitated, then moved closer to the fire, turning to give her access to the torn fabric. She worked carefully, aware of his tension the way he held himself perfectly still. Through the tears, she could see old scars crossing his ribs, some that looked like claw marks, others that might have been from knives or bullets. "You've survived a lot," she said quietly, not making it a question. His shoulders moved in what might have been acknowledgement. As she worked, Eleanor found herself talking, partly to fill the silence, partly because something about the darkness and firelight made confession easier. "My husband, my first husband, was named James. He was a good man, gentle, too gentle for the men who wanted our land." Her needle paused. "They shot him in the back while he was plowing. Said it was a hunting accident, but the ball came from a Spencer rifle, and everyone knew only one man in the county had one." Jacob turned his head slightly, listening. "The law did nothing, said there wasn't enough evidence. The man who killed James sat in church every Sunday after that, smiling at me like he'd done me a favor." She resumed sewing, her stitches careful and tight. "I sold the farm to him for half its worth. What choice did I have? A widow alone, no family, neighbors who looked the other way." She finished with the worst tear and moved to another. "That's when I answered Samuel Morrison's advertisement. A new start, he promised. A place where the past didn't matter." She laughed bitterly. "Instead, I found another town full of frightened people ready to hang a man without knowing his truth." Jacob shifted, and she realized he was looking at her directly for the first time since they'd made camp. In the firelight, his gray eyes held something that might have been understanding. "I know you have a story too," Eleanor said. "When you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'll listen. But I won't push. We've both had enough of people demanding things from us." She finished the last repair she could manage in the dim light and tied off the thread. "There, not pretty, but it'll hold." Jacob examined her work, running a finger along the neat stitches. Then he did something that surprised her. He reached for her carpetbag and gestured questioningly. "You want to see what else needs mending?" He shook his head and pointed to the bag's handle, which was indeed coming loose from the body. "Oh, yes, that's been worrying me. If it breaks entirely." He held out his shackled hands for the bag. Despite her curiosity, Eleanor handed it over. He examined the failing connection with the same focused attention he'd given to building the fire. Then he began working, using his teeth to hold the leather while his bound hands pulled fallen stitches free and rewove them in a stronger pattern. "Do you know leather work?" Eleanor observed. A pause in his movements, then a small nod. "Were you a craftsman before?" His hand stilled completely. For a moment she thought she'd pushed too far, then he set the bag aside and held up his hands, showing her his palms in the firelight. Even beneath the dirt and recent wounds, she could see the calluses of long labor, the particular patterns that came from working with tools. He pointed to the fire, then made a hammering motion. "A blacksmith." He tilted his hand back and forth, close, but not quite. "Farrier." Another partial gesture. "Both? You worked with metal and horses?" This time a clear nod. He picked up a small stick and smoothed a patch of dirt near the fire. With careful strokes, he drew the outline of a horseshoe, then added decorative elements, the kind of fancy work that spoke of skill beyond mere function. "You were an artist," Eleanor said softly. "Not just a tradesman." Something flickered across his face. Pride, perhaps, or pain at the memory. He scrubbed out the drawing with his palm and returned to fixing her bag. Eleanor watched him work, noting the way he compensated for the shackles, how even in chains his hands moved with remembered skill. She thought of the town's stories, a wild man, a killer, a beast in human form. Yet here he sat, carefully repairing her belongings with patient concentration. When he finished, the handle was stronger than it had been when new. He tested it several times before handing it back, apparently satisfied. "Thank you," Eleanor said. "That's twice tonight you've helped me when you didn't have to." He shrugged, then gestured to his mended shirt. "Fair trade?" She smiled slightly. "I suppose it is." The fire had burned lower, and the desert cold was creeping in. Eleanor pulled out her single blanket, worn thin from use. She looked at it, then at Jacob, who had settled himself against a rock at the edge of the firelight. "We'll share," she decided. "It's not proper, I know, but propriety seems foolish out here." He shook his head firmly and pointed to himself, then the ground. "You'll freeze." Another shake of the head. He pulled his knees to his chest, wrapped his arms around them as best he could with the chains, and demonstrated how he intended to sleep. "That's ridiculous. We're married, strange as the circumstances are, and I won't have you catching cold on my account." Eleanor spread the blanket on the ground near the fire. "There's room enough for two if we're careful." For a long moment, Jacob didn't move. Then, slowly, he shifted closer. He lay down on the very edge of the blanket, his back to her, taking up as little space as possible. Eleanor settled herself a careful distance away, but close enough to pull the blanket over both of them. The chains clinked softly as he adjusted position, trying to find a way to rest that didn't put pressure on his bound wrists. Without thinking, Eleanor reached out and touched his shoulder. He flinched so violently, the blanket nearly came off entirely. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to startle you, the shackles must hurt." He lay still, breathing carefully. Then, almost imperceptibly, he relaxed. When Eleanor didn't move her hand, he shifted slightly, acknowledging the touch without pulling away. "Tomorrow we'll find a way to remove them," she promised. Sheriff Bradley said to send them back with a traveler, but he didn't say they had to stay on until then. A soft exhale that might have been agreement or doubt. They lay quiet then, strangers bound by law and desperation, sharing warmth against the desert cold. Eleanor stared up at the vast scatter of stars, more visible here than they'd ever been in Ohio. Beside her, Jacob's breathing gradually steadied, though she suspected he wasn't truly sleeping any more than she was. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled and others answered. The sound should have been frightening, but after the human cruelty of Fallow Ridge, it seemed almost welcoming. At least wild things were honest in their nature. Eleanor thought about the morning, about the uncertain road ahead. She'd married a man who couldn't or wouldn't speak, who carried violence in his past and gentleness in his hands. A man who built fires with the care of someone who'd seen too many things burn, who shared food like someone who'd known hunger. "Jacob?" she whispered, not sure if he was awake. A slight movement indicated he was listening. "I want you to know, I don't expect anything from this marriage except what we choose to make of it. You're free now, or will be once those shackles come off. If you want to leave, find your own way. I won't stop you." Silence stretched between them. Then she felt him shift, turning just enough that she could see his profile in the dying firelight. He pointed to her, then to himself, then pressed his palms together as he had during their makeshift ceremony. A promise, she realized. Whatever else he couldn't or wouldn't say, he was telling her he would honor what had passed between them. "All right," she whispered. "We'll figure it out together." He turned back, settling into his careful position at the blanket's edge. But the distance between them felt less vast now, bridged by small kindnesses and shared understanding. The fire burned down to embers, the stars wheeled overhead, and somewhere in the vast Colorado night, two broken people began the slow work of learning to trust again. Dawn came slowly to the desert, painting the rocks in shades of rose and gold. Eleanor woke to find the blanket tucked carefully around her and Jacob gone. For a moment, panic seized her. Had he left after all? Then she saw him by the remains of their fire, working at something with intense concentration. He'd found a suitable stone and was using it to file at the shackle locks, the chain stretched taut between his wrists. The metal was already marked with grooves from what must have been an hour's work or more. "Let me help," Eleanor said, sitting up. He shook his head without looking up, continuing his patient grinding. She noticed his wrists were raw where the metal had rubbed during his efforts, spots of blood showing through the dirt. From her carpet bag, Eleanor pulled out a small tin of salve another of her precious remaining supplies. "At least let me tend those wounds." This time he paused, glancing at her with those storm-gray eyes. After a moment's hesitation, he set down the stone and held out his hands. Eleanor worked carefully, cleaning the abraded skin with water from the canteen before applying the salve. His hands remained perfectly still, though she could feel the tension in them. Up close, she could see more clearly the scars that covered his palms and fingers, burns, cuts, the inevitable marks of a life working with hot metal and sharp tools. "These are old," she said, tracing a particularly deep scar across his palm. "You've been at your trade a long time." He nodded slightly, watching her work with an unreadable expression. When she finished, he returned to his filing. Eleanor busied herself with breaking camp, such as it was, but found herself watching him work. There was something almost meditative in his focus. The steady scrape of stone on metal marking time like a strange clock. By the time the sun had fully risen, he'd worn through one pin. The shackle opened with a click that seemed to echo across the empty landscape. Jacob stared at his freed hand as if he'd forgotten what it looked like unbound. "One more," Eleanor encouraged. He switched the stone to his freed hand and attacked the second lock with renewed energy. This one went faster, and soon the shackles fell away entirely, landing in the dust with a final clank. Jacob rubbed his wrists, flexing his fingers, rolling his shoulders. Then he picked up the chains and walked to a nearby rock outcropping. With sudden violence, he swung the shackles against the stone, again and again, until the metal was twisted and bent beyond use. He stood there breathing hard, staring at the ruined restraints, and Eleanor saw years of fury in that destruction. Finally, he hurled the twisted metal into a ravine and turned back to her. His face was calmer now, as if breaking the chains had released something poisonous. "Better?" Eleanor asked softly. He nodded, then surprised her by taking her hand briefly in both of his. A touch of gratitude before he pulled away and began gathering their few supplies. They traveled through the morning, following the wagon trail as it wound higher into the foothills. Jacob walked differently now without the chains, his stride longer, more confident. He ranged ahead sometimes, scouting the trail, but always returned to walk beside her. As the sun climbed higher, Eleanor found herself struggling with the heat and the increasingly rough terrain. Her boots, already worn, were never meant for such travel. When she stumbled for the third time, Jacob stopped. He pointed to a shady spot beneath an overhanging rock, then to her feet. The message was clear rest. "I'm fine," Eleanor protested, though her feet throbbed with each step. He shook his head firmly and guided her to the shade. Once she was seated, he knelt and gently removed one of her boots. Even through her stocking, she could feel blisters forming. Jacob examined her foot with the same careful attention he gave everything, then looked up at her with concern. He pointed to the boots, made a walking motion, then shook his head. "I know they're not suitable, but they're all I have." He held up a finger, "Wait," and disappeared again. This time he returned with strips of soft bark from a cottonwood tree they'd passed earlier. With gestures, he showed her how to wrap her feet before putting the boots back on. The difference was immediate. The bark provided cushioning where she needed it most, and when they resumed walking, the pain was manageable. They were climbing steadily now, the desert giving way to scattered pines. As they rounded a bend, Eleanor gasped. Below them stretched a valley she recognized from Samuel Morrison's letters. The land he'd claimed. The home he'd promised. But where she'd expected to see a cabin, perhaps smoke from a chimney, there was only emptiness. The land was there, yes, good bottomland, near a creek, sheltered by ridges on three sides. But no sign of human habitation beyond some old foundation stones. "He never built anything," Eleanor said, sinking onto a fallen log. "All those letters about the house he was preparing, the life we'd have, lies." Jacob stood beside her, studying the valley with narrowed eyes. Then he touched her shoulder gently and pointed. Following his gesture, Eleanor saw what she'd missed. A small structure near the creek, partially hidden by trees. "Is that?" He nodded and led the way down the slope. It wasn't a house, barely qualified as a shelter. Someone had started a dugout cabin cutting into the hillside and framing the front with logs. But the work was abandoned, the roof half finished, the door nothing but an opening. Eleanor walked inside, her footsteps echoing on the dirt floor. "He started it at least," she said, trying to find something positive. "The bones of something are here." Jacob examined the structure with professional interest, testing the log supports, checking where the roof beams should connect. He looked at Eleanor and made a questioning gesture toward the shelter, then a building motion with his hands. "You're asking if I want to finish it?" A nod. Eleanor looked around the pitiful beginning of what should have been her home. "With what? I have $17 to my name, no tools, no supplies." Jacob held up his hands, wiggling his fingers. Then he pointed to the forest around them, the creek, the stone outcroppings. His meaning was clear. He had skills, and nature provided materials. "You'd help me build it? Why?" He was quiet for a long moment, then walked to where a shaft of sunlight fell through the unfinished roof. In the dust, he drew with his finger, a simple house, stick figures beside it. He pointed to her, to himself, to the drawing. "A home," Eleanor whispered. "You're saying we could make a home?" He nodded, then added more to the drawing. What might have been a garden, a corral, smoke rising from a chimney. Not just a shelter, but a life. Eleanor felt tears threaten. After so much loss, so much disappointment, this silent man was offering to help her build what Samuel Morrison had only promised. "All right," she said. "We'll try." Jacob's rare smile transformed his face, easing years from his weathered features. He immediately began planning, pacing off the dimensions, examining the existing structure more carefully. He found a stick and smoothed a patch of ground, beginning to sketch improvements. But as he drew, his expression gradually changed. The enthusiasm faded, replaced by something darker. His hand slowed, then stopped. He stared at the plans he'd drawn as if seeing something else entirely. "Jacob?" He stood abruptly, walking away from the shelter. Eleanor followed, concerned, and found him standing rigid beside the creek, fists clenched at his sides. "What is it? What's wrong?" He turned to her, and the pain in his eyes was so raw it took her breath away. He pointed to the shelter, made the building motion again, then drew his finger across his throat. Then he pointed to himself and covered his face with his hands. Eleanor tried to understand. "Building, death, you. Someone died while building." He nodded, then held up 3 fingers. 3 people. He pointed to himself again, then made a gesture that encompassed everything. The valley, the sky, the simple peace of the place. He'd had this once, Eleanor realized. A home, a family, a life of building and creating. "Your family," she said softly. "You lost them." His nod was barely perceptible. He turned back to the creek, shoulders bowed as if carrying invisible weight. Eleanor approached slowly, remembering his reaction to touch the night before. "How?" she asked gently. Jacob knelt by the water, scooping up a handful of pebbles. He arranged them carefully. 1 larger stone, 2 smaller ones. A man and 2 children, she guessed. Then he added another stone slightly apart. A woman. He pointed to the woman's stone, then mimed cradling a baby. She died in childbirth, perhaps, leaving him with 2 children. He scattered those stones with a violent gesture, then arranged new ones. Many stones this time, surrounding the 3. He picked up a stick and made stabbing, violent motions at the 3 stones while pointing to the many. "Raiders? Bandits?" A nod. He touched the large stone himself, then mimed fighting. But there had been too many. He touched the 2 smaller stones gently, then covered them with dirt, his hands shaking. "Your children," Eleanor breathed. "Oh, Jacob." He wasn't finished. He pointed to the shelter they'd just left, then to his throat again, made building motions, then wrapped his hands around his own neck. The message was horrifying in its clarity. After losing his family, he'd tried to build again somewhere else, and someone had tried to hang him for it. "The town," Eleanor said. "Fallow Ridge. They tried to hang you before, didn't they? Not for murder, but for something else." for being different, for grieving in ways they didn't understand. He nodded slowly, touching his throat where old rope scars suddenly made sense. And you stopped speaking after that? He pointed to the 2 small stones he'd covered, touched his throat, then shook his head. The words had died with his children. Eleanor felt her own tears falling now. But they didn't succeed in hanging you. You survived, went into the mountains. He gestured to show years passing, seasons changing, living wild, alone, silent. Then he made a gesture of someone approaching, held up his hands as if defending himself. Tom Garrett. He came to your cave and you defended yourself. A firm nod. He showed how the man had come at him with a weapon, how he'd fought back out of instinct, years of solitude making him react like the wild thing they'd accused him of being. It was self-defense, just as I thought. Jacob stood, brushing dirt from his hands. He looked at the shelter again, and Eleanor could see him fighting with himself, the desire to build warring with the memory of what building had cost him before. It doesn't have to be the same, Eleanor said quietly. I'm not her, whoever she was, and you're not the same man who lost everything. We're both different now, marked by our losses but not defined by them. He looked at her for a long moment, then walked back to the shelter. This time, when he picked up the stick to draw plans, his hand was steadier. He added to his earlier sketch practical improvements, nothing fancy. A solid roof, a proper door, a fireplace for warmth. Eleanor watched him work, seeing how building brought him peace even as it brought pain. We'll go slow, she promised. No rush, no pressure, just making something useful from what's broken. He paused in his drawing to look at her, and she wondered if he heard the double meaning in her words. Then he nodded and returned to his plans, occasionally glancing at her as if to ask her opinion. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, they worked together to clear the shelter enough to sleep in for the night. Jacob showed her which stones would work best for a fire ring, which wood would burn cleanest. Eleanor gathered pine needles for bedding, swept the dirt floor smooth. When darkness fell, they had a fire crackling in what would someday be a proper hearth. The half-built walls provided some shelter from the wind, and stars showed through the gaps in the roof like promises of what could be. Jacob had found a piece of charcoal from their fire and was drawing on a flat stone. Not building plans this time, but something more delicate. When he finished, he handed it to her. It was a simple drawing, but rendered with surprising skill, a woman's profile that might have been Eleanor herself, looking not back toward the past, but forward into empty space waiting to be filled. Thank you, she said, touched by the gift. He pointed to her, then to himself, then to the shelter around them. Then he did something that surprised her. He spoke. Just one word, rough with disuse, barely more than a whisper. Home. The question in it broke her heart and mended it all at once. Yes, Eleanor said firmly. Home. They had been working on the shelter for 3 weeks when the need for supplies forced them to consider the inevitable, a trip to the nearest town. Cedar Falls lay a day's ride to the north, and while it meant risking recognition and judgment, they needed tools, nails, and provisions that the land couldn't provide. Jacob had traded work for an old mule with a traveling peddler who'd passed through the valley. The man had been wary at first, but Jacob's skill in fixing his broken wagon wheel had won him over. Now they had transportation, though the mule was as stubborn as it was sturdy. The morning they set out for Cedar Falls, Eleanor noticed Jacob's increasing tension. He checked and rechecked their supplies, adjusted the mule's lead rope countless times, and kept scanning the horizon as if expecting trouble. We don't have to go, Eleanor said gently. We can make do with what we have. He shook his head and pointed to the list she'd made, items they truly needed if they were to survive winter. Nails, tar paper for the roof, a saw, flour, salt, necessities, not luxuries. The trail to Cedar Falls wound through a narrow canyon, walls of red rock rising on either side. Jacob walked ahead, leading the mule while Eleanor rode. She'd protested this arrangement, but he'd insisted with gestures that made his reasoning clear. If they needed to run, she'd move faster mounted. They were perhaps halfway through the canyon when it happened. The mule's ears went flat against its head, and Jacob froze mid-step. Then Eleanor heard it too. Horses approaching from behind, moving fast. Jacob quickly guided the mule to a wider spot in the trail and positioned himself between Eleanor and whoever was coming. His hand went to the knife at his belt, the only weapon they had. 3 riders rounded the bend, horses lathered with sweat. Eleanor's heart sank as she recognized the lead rider, Marcus Garrett, brother of the man Jacob had killed in self-defense. "Well, well," Garrett said, reining in his horse. "The beast and his bride. Folks in Fallow Ridge said you'd headed this way." The 2 men with him spread out, blocking any escape route. Eleanor noticed they all wore guns, while Jacob had only his knife. "We want no trouble," Eleanor said, keeping her voice steady. "We're just going to town for supplies." "Supplies?" Garrett laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think you can just waltz into civilization like nothing happened? Like my brother's blood doesn't cry out for justice?" Jacob stepped forward slightly, putting himself more firmly between the riders and Eleanor. His stance was protective but not aggressive, trying not to provoke. "Your man there killed Tom in cold blood," Garrett continued. "Sheriff Bradley might have let you walk away, but family justice runs deeper than law." "It was self-defense," Eleanor said. "Your brother attacked him first." "So says a man who won't even speak to defend himself. Convenient, isn't it?" Garrett's hand moved to his gun. "Step away from him, woman. This isn't your fight." Eleanor slid down from the mule, but instead of moving away, she stepped closer to Jacob. "I'm his wife. His fight is mine." "Then you're a fool who'll die with him." The moment stretched taut. Eleanor could feel Jacob coiled beside her, ready to fight despite the odds. The canyon walls seemed to press closer, the air thick with threat. Then, unexpectedly, one of Garrett's companions spoke up. "Marcus, maybe we should—" "Shut up, Dale." Garrett's eyes never left Jacob. "You got anything to say for yourself, beast? Any last words before I put you down like the animal you are?" Jacob remained silent, but Eleanor saw him shift slightly, preparing to push her aside if gunfire started. "He can't speak," Eleanor said. "Trauma took his voice years ago, but if he could, he'd tell you the same truth. Your brother came to his camp armed, looking for trouble. Jacob defended himself, nothing more." "Liar." But doubt flickered in Garrett's eyes. He'd expected fear, perhaps, or violent resistance, not this calm readiness to die protecting someone. The mule, sensing the tension, began to shift nervously. Its movement broke the frozen moment, and in that instant, Jacob did something unexpected. Moving slowly, he reached into his shirt and pulled out a small object on a leather cord. It was a child's toy, a tiny carved horse, worn smooth from handling. He held it up where Garrett could see it, then pointed to himself, then made a cradling motion. The message was clear. He too had lost family. He understood grief. "What's that supposed to mean?" Garrett demanded, but his voice had lost some of its edge. Eleanor stepped forward carefully. "He lost his children, his whole family, killed by raiders. He knows what it's like to want revenge, to need someone to blame." She looked directly at Garrett. "But killing him won't bring your brother back. It'll just add more blood to blood." The silence stretched again, but this time it felt different. Garrett's companion Dale spoke again. "Marcus, Tom always was hot-headed. You know that. Maybe there's truth to what she's saying. You taking their side?" "I'm saying Tom went up into those mountains looking for someone to blame for his cattle going missing. If he found this man and drew on him first—" "He was my brother?" "And he's dead," Dale said firmly. "Nothing we do here changes that." Jacob slowly lowered the carved horse, tucking it back into his shirt. Then, surprising everyone, he knelt in the dust. Not in submission, Eleanor realized, but in acknowledgement. He drew in the dirt with his finger 2 figures facing each other, one falling. Then he pointed to himself and covered his eyes with his hands. He was sorry, not admitting guilt, but expressing sorrow for the necessity of defending himself, for the pain it had caused. Garrett stared at the silent man kneeling in the dust, this supposed beast who carried a child's toy next to his heart. Something in his face shifted, the rage giving way to a deeper, more complex emotion. "Get up," he said roughly. "Get up, damn you." Jacob rose slowly, his eyes never leaving Garrett's face. "I should kill you," Garrett said. "Should put a bullet in you right now." His hand tightened on his gun, then loosened. But Dale's right. Tom was always quick to anger, quick to blame others for his troubles. And He stopped, swallowing hard. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "I saw what you did to those shackles. Saw them in the ravine, beaten to scrap. Only a man who'd been caged unjustly would have that much rage at chains." The gun hand dropped to his side. "Get out of here. Take your supplies and go. But if I see you again, if you come near my family—" "We understand," Eleanor said quickly. "We just want to live in peace." Garrett turned his horse, then paused. "That valley you're in, Morrison's old claim. Tom had his eye on that land. That's probably why." He shook his head. "Just watch yourselves. Not everyone will be as understanding as I'm being today." The three riders moved past them, continuing up the canyon. As they disappeared around a bend, Eleanor realized she'd been holding her breath. Beside her, Jacob sagged slightly, the tension leaving his body. "That was brave," she said softly. "Kneeling like that, showing him your grief." Jacob touched the spot where the carved horse lay hidden, then looked at her with those storm-gray eyes. He touched her arm gently. "Thanks for standing with him." They continued their journey in subdued silence, both aware of how close they'd come to disaster. The canyon eventually opened into a wider valley, and Cedar Falls appeared, smaller than Fallow Ridge but bustling with activity. Eleanor could feel Jacob's tension return as they entered the town. People stared, whispered, pointed. News traveled fast in the territories, and their story had clearly preceded them. At the general store, the proprietor looked ready to refuse their business until Eleanor placed silver coins on the counter. "We need supplies," she said firmly. "We'll pay fair price and cause no trouble." The man's eyes darted between her and Jacob, who stood quietly by the door, making himself as unobtrusive as possible. "I heard about you two," the proprietor said finally. "The woman who married the wild man of the mountains." "My husband is a skilled craftsman who was wrongly accused," Eleanor replied. "We're building a home in the valley, living peacefully. That's all." Something in her direct gaze must have convinced him, because he began gathering their requested items. Other customers gave them wide berth, but Eleanor noticed not all the looks were hostile. Some held curiosity, even a grudging respect. While Eleanor handled the purchases, Jacob slipped outside. She found him by the mule, running his hands along the animal's legs, checking for stones in its hooves, anything to avoid the stares and whispers. A small girl, perhaps 6 years old, had crept close to watch. Her mother stood nearby, ready to snatch her away, but the child seemed fascinated rather than frightened. As Eleanor watched, the girl held out a penny. "Mister," she said, "your mule looks tired. This is for carrots for him." Jacob froze, staring at the child. Slowly, carefully, he knelt to her level. Instead of taking the penny, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something Eleanor hadn't seen before. A tiny wooden bird, no bigger than a walnut. He offered it to the girl, who took it with wondering eyes. "Oh, it's beautiful." She turned to her mother. "Look, Mama, he made me a bird." The woman approached cautiously, but seeing her daughter's joy, she managed a small smile. "Thank you," she said to Jacob. That's very kind." Jacob nodded and rose, stepping back to give them space. The girl skipped away, showing her treasure to anyone who would look. Her mother glanced back once, and Eleanor saw her whisper to another woman, not the fearful gossip of before, but something else. Wonder, perhaps, that the wild man of the mountains would carry toys to give to children. They loaded their supplies quickly, both eager to leave town behind. But as they departed, Eleanor noticed something had shifted. Not everyone stared with fear now. Some looked thoughtful, reconsidering the stories they'd heard. "You changed something today," Eleanor told Jacob as Cedar Falls disappeared behind them. "With Garrett, with that little girl. You showed them who you really are." He shrugged, uncomfortable with the observation. But Eleanor saw him touch the carved horse again, and she understood. He'd lost the ability to speak, but not the ability to communicate. And sometimes action spoke truths that words could only approximate. The journey home was uneventful, though they both remained watchful. As they descended into their valley, the half-built shelter coming into view, Eleanor felt something ease in her chest. Home. Still more dream than reality, but taking shape day by day. Jacob must have felt it too, because he picked up the pace, eager to return to their work. Tomorrow they would continue building, turning Samuel Morrison's broken promises into something real and solid. But today, they had survived civilization, faced down revenge, and returned with what they needed. It was enough. More than enough. It was a beginning. The autumn wind carried the bite of coming winter as Eleanor and Jacob made their second trip to Cedar Falls. 2 months had passed since their encounter with Marcus Garrett, and their shelter had transformed into something resembling a proper cabin. They needed winter supplies now. Heavy cloth for curtains, extra blankets, preserved foods to supplement what Eleanor had managed to put by from her garden. This time Jacob walked with more confidence, though he still kept close to Eleanor as they entered town. The stairs were fewer, the whispers quieter. The story of the wooden bird had spread, along with tales from the traveling peddler about Jacob's skill with repairs. Fear was giving way to cautious curiosity. At the general store, Mr. Henderson greeted them with a nod. "Mrs. Stone, Mr. Stone, what can I help you with today?" Eleanor managed not to show her surprise at the respectful address. She handed over her list, and while Henderson gathered items, she noticed a help-wanted sign in the window. "You need assistance?" she asked. "My back's not what it was," Henderson admitted. "Need someone to help with heavy lifting, deliveries, but finding reliable help in a mining town." He shrugged. Eleanor glanced at Jacob, who was examining a display of tools with professional interest. "My husband is very strong and completely reliable." Henderson's eyebrows rose. "He'd have to deal with customers. And he doesn't." "Speak," Eleanor finished. "No, but he understands everything, follows directions perfectly. And his work speaks for itself." The shopkeeper looked uncertain. Then the bell above the door chimed, and a woman entered supporting an elderly man who walked with a pronounced limp. "Mr. Henderson," the woman said, distressed. Father's cane broke again. "We've tried to repair it, but—" Without hesitation, Jacob stepped forward. He gently took the broken cane, examining the split in the wood and the bent metal support. He looked at Henderson, pointed to some supplies on a shelf, and raised his eyebrows in question. "Go ahead," Henderson said, curious. Jacob selected a leather strip, some small nails, and a metal bracket. Working at the counter with swift, sure movements, he reinforced the split wood, created a stronger joint, and wrapped the handle with leather for a better grip. Within minutes, he handed the restored cane back to the elderly man. The old fellow tested it, his face brightening. "Why, it's better than new, steadier, and the grip doesn't hurt my hand." He reached for his purse. "What do I owe you?" Jacob shook his head and stepped back, pointing to Henderson. "No charge, Mr. Brewster," Henderson said slowly, watching Jacob with new interest. "Consider it a demonstration of what good help can do." After the Brewsters left with profuse thanks, Henderson turned to Eleanor. "Can he start tomorrow? I'll pay fair wages, $1.50 a day, plus he can take home any damaged goods he can repair." Eleanor looked at Jacob, who nodded slowly. "We'll need to arrange the schedule. We're a day's ride from town." 3 days a week would suffice. You could stay at the boarding house. Mrs. Daugherty keeps a clean place, and meals are included. They worked out the details while Jacob loaded their purchases. As they prepared to leave, a commotion erupted in the street. A freight wagon had overturned, spilling barrels and crates across the muddy thoroughfare. The driver was pinned beneath, cursing and calling for help. Jacob dropped their supplies and ran to the accident. Other men were already there, trying unsuccessfully to lift the wagon. Jacob assessed the situation quickly, then began directing the rescue with gestures. He positioned men at specific points, used a plank as a lever, and coordinated the lift with hand signals. Eleanor watched with the gathering crowd as Jacob's calm efficiency turned chaos into organized action. Within minutes, they had the wagon raised and the driver pulled free. The man's leg was injured but not crushed, thanks to the speed of the rescue. "Someone fetch Doc Morrison," a voice called, and Eleanor startled at the name. But the doctor who arrived was an elderly man, no relation to her absent intended. As the doctor tended the injured driver, the crowd's attention turned to Jacob. Men who'd worked alongside him in the rescue clapped him on the shoulder, offering thanks for his quick thinking. "Could have been much worse without you taking charge," one said. "Where'd you learn to handle emergencies like that?" another asked. Jacob merely nodded acknowledgement and returned to Eleanor's side. But she saw something ease in his posture. For a few minutes, he'd been just another man helping in a crisis, valued for his skills rather than feared for his silence. "That was well done," a familiar voice said behind them. Eleanor turned to find Marcus Garrett watching from the boardwalk. Her hand instinctively found Jacob's arm, but Garrett raised a peaceful hand. "I'm not here for trouble," he said. "Just in town on business." He studied Jacob for a moment. "You know, I asked around after our encounter, found some interesting stories. Seems there was a blacksmith up in the northern settlements, lost his family to Comanche raiders about 5 years back. Man named Josiah Brennan. Folks said he was gifted with metalwork, gentle with children, devoted to his family." Jacob had gone very still. "They also said he went mad with grief," Garrett continued. "Disappeared into the mountains. Most figured he died up there." He paused. "But maybe he just needed time to find his way back to the world." Eleanor felt Jacob's arm trembling beneath her hand. Garrett noticed too. "I won't spread it around," he said quietly. "Man's got a right to bury his past if he needs to. Just thought you should know, Tom wasn't the first to go treasure hunting in those mountains, looking for the wild man's hoard. He heard stories about a blacksmith who might have hidden money up there." His mouth twisted. "Greed killed my brother as much as anything. I see that now." He touched his hat to Eleanor. "Ma'am, you were right. Blood added to blood solves nothing." To Jacob, he added, "I hope you find peace, Brennan. Or Stone. Or whoever you choose to be now." After Garrett left, they stood in silence among their loaded supplies. Eleanor wanted to ask about the name, about whether Garrett's information was true, but she sensed this wasn't the time. Jacob, Josiah, looked lost in memory, his hand unconsciously moving to the carved horse beneath his shirt. "Ready to go home?" she asked gently. He nodded, seeming to come back to himself. As they left town, Eleanor noticed more changes in how people watched them. The rescue had shifted something. Men nodded respectfully to Jacob. Women offered small smiles to Eleanor. They were becoming part of the town's story in a new way, not as the beast and his foolish bride, but as the silent craftsman and the woman brave enough to see past fear. The next morning, back at their cabin, Eleanor woke to find Jacob already up, standing in the doorway watching the sunrise. Something about his posture seemed different, less guarded, more present. "Josiah?" she said softly, testing the name. He turned, and she saw tears on his face, but he nodded, acknowledging the truth of it. "Would you prefer I call you that?" He considered, then shook his head. He picked up a stick and wrote in the dirt. "Josiah died with them. Jacob was born from the ashes." Eleanor rose and stood beside him, not touching but offering presence. "Then Jacob, you'll remain. The past can inform us without defining us." He looked at her with such gratitude that her heart ached. Then he did something that surprised her. He spoke. Not the single word from weeks ago, but a full sentence, rusty and painful but clear. "Thank you for seeing me." The effort seemed to exhaust him, and he didn't try for more words. But Eleanor understood. In defending him publicly, in standing by him when the town would have rejected him, she'd given him something he'd lost, the possibility of being seen as human again. "You're welcome," she said simply. They stood together watching the sun paint their valley gold, two damaged people building something new from the ruins of their pasts. Tomorrow, Jacob would return to town for his first day of work at Henderson's store. He would face the challenge of dealing with customers who might fear or pity him, of navigating a world that expected words he couldn't easily give. But today, he had a name again, even if it wasn't the one he'd been born with. He had work that valued his skills. He had a community beginning to accept him, and he had Eleanor, who asked nothing more than what he could freely give. "I should check the roof before we leave tomorrow," he managed, the words coming easier with practice. "Rain's coming." Eleanor smiled, hearing in those practical words a future being built one small sentence at a time. "I'll help," she said. "We're partners in this, remember?" He nodded, and she thought she saw the ghost of a smile cross his face. Then he went to gather the tools, moving with purpose toward the life they were creating together. The townspeople might whisper their story for years. The mail-order bride who married a wild man, the beast who turned out to be a grieving father, the woman who saw past fear to find the human beneath. But here in their valley, they were simply Eleanor and Jacob, building a home strong enough to shelter two wounded hearts learning to trust again. Winter had settled over the valley like a thick quilt, transforming their small homestead into something from a fairy tale. Snow crowned the cabin roof that Jacob had reinforced just in time, and ice crystals decorated the windows Eleanor had insisted on installing despite the expense. Inside, the fireplace Jacob had built with meticulous care kept them warm, its stones fitted so perfectly that not a wisp of smoke escaped into the room. Eleanor stood at the table, kneading bread dough with flour they'd bought with Jacob's earnings from the store. 3 months of work had brought in enough money to see them through winter comfortably, and Jacob had repaired so many items for grateful customers that their cabin now boasted several payment pieces: a rocking chair, iron skillets, even a small mirror that caught the morning light. She heard the steady rhythm of Jacob's hammer from outside where he was working on something in the small shed he'd built. He'd been secretive about this project for weeks, disappearing into the shed whenever he had spare time. Eleanor respected his privacy, understanding that a man who'd lost everything needed something that was purely his. The bread was rising by the fire when she heard horses approaching. Eleanor tensed. Visitors were rare in winter, and rarely brought good news. She wiped her hands on her apron and reached for the rifle Jacob had taught her to use. But the voice that called out was familiar and welcome. "Mrs. Stone, it's Dr. Morrison from town. I have someone with me who needs help." Eleanor opened the door to find the elderly doctor supporting a young woman who could barely stand. She was heavily pregnant and clearly in distress. "Found her on the road," Dr. Morrison explained as Eleanor helped them inside. "Her wagon broke an axle. Her husband rode ahead for help, but with this storm coming..." He shook his head. "I remembered you were closest." "Of course. Bring her in." Eleanor guided them to the bed. "What's your name, dear?" "Sarah," the woman gasped. "Sarah Winters. The baby. It's coming too early." Dr. Morrison examined her quickly. "Not too early, I think, but soon. Very soon." He looked at Eleanor. "I'll need hot water, clean cloths, and someone with steady hands. Is your husband..." The shed door opened and Jacob appeared, drawn by the voices. He took in the scene with one glance and immediately began preparing what was needed without being asked. He stoked the fire higher, filled the large pot with water, and gathered clean linens from Eleanor's carefully maintained stores. "Good man," Dr. Morrison murmured. "Now, Mrs. Winters, let's see about bringing this baby safely into the world." The hours that followed were intense. Eleanor had attended births before. It was expected of women in small communities, but never in her own home, never with the weight of someone else's life in her hands. She followed Dr. Morrison's instructions carefully, while Jacob maintained the fire and supplied whatever was needed. Sarah Winters proved to be stronger than she looked. Between contractions, she told them about the homestead she and her husband were trying to establish further up the mountain. "We thought we had more time," she said. "The baby wasn't due for another month." "Babies keep their own schedules," Dr. Morrison said kindly. "Now, when the next pain comes..." Jacob had retreated to the corner, but Eleanor noticed him watching with an intensity that went beyond mere concern. His hand had found the carved horse at his chest, and she realized he'd been through this before. Different circumstances, certainly, but he'd waited while a woman labored, had hoped for a safe delivery. As if sensing his distress, Sarah looked at him between contractions. "I'm glad you're here," she said simply. "Both of you. I was so frightened alone on that road." Jacob nodded, and to Eleanor's surprise, spoke. "You're safe now." The words were rough but clear, and Sarah smiled despite her pain. "My husband will be so grateful. He was beside himself when the wagon broke. We've lost so much already. Our first home to fire, our savings to a failed bank. This baby is our hope for starting over." Eleanor saw Jacob flinch at the mention of fire, but he stepped forward. With careful gestures, he asked if he could help. Dr. Morrison nodded, and Jacob took his place supporting Sarah's shoulders during the hardest contractions. "That's it," the doctor encouraged. "Not much longer now." The storm Dr. Morrison had predicted arrived in full force, wind howling around the cabin walls. But inside, there was only the ancient rhythm of birth, the circle of lamplight, and the focused work of bringing new life safely into the world. When the baby finally arrived, a healthy girl with strong lungs and her mother's dark hair, Eleanor found tears on her cheeks. She glanced at Jacob and saw his face transformed with wonder and old grief mixed together. "She's perfect," Sarah whispered, cradling her daughter. "Oh, she's perfect." Dr. Morrison cleaned his instruments with satisfaction. "Mother and child both doing well. You've got a fighter there, Mrs. Winters." The door burst open, bringing a swirl of snow and a frantic man. "Sarah, I'm sorry, I couldn't find—" He stopped, seeing his wife holding their baby, and nearly collapsed with relief. "Tom, come meet your daughter," Sarah said, glowing despite her exhaustion. Tom Winters crossed to his wife in 2 strides, falling to his knees beside the bed. "I thought I'd lost you. The storm came so fast and I couldn't—" "Shh," Sarah soothed. "We're fine. These good people took care of us." Tom looked up at Eleanor and Jacob with tears streaming down his face. "I don't know how to thank you. We have so little, but whatever we can do—" "You owe us nothing," Eleanor said firmly. "Neighbors help neighbors. That's how it works out here." Dr. Morrison, packing his bag, disagreed. "Nonsense. These two turned their home into a birthing room and assisted me admirably. At the very least, Mr. Winters, you should know that Mr. Stone here is the finest craftsman in the territory, if you need anything built or repaired." Tom studied Jacob with interest. "You're the one who's been doing such good work at Henderson's store. I've heard about you." He paused. "I'm a fair carpenter myself, if you ever need an extra pair of hands." Jacob nodded, and Eleanor saw a possibility spark between the two men. The beginning of the kind of partnership that built communities in hard places. They kept the Winters family for 3 days until the storm passed and Sarah was strong enough to travel. During that time, the small cabin felt full in a way it hadn't before. Tom proved to be talkative enough for 2 men, filling Jacob's silence with easy chatter about building plans and dreams for the future. Sarah insisted on helping Eleanor with cooking despite her weakness, and the baby named Hope brought a lightness to the home that had been missing. On the second night, Eleanor woke to find Jacob's side of the bed empty. She found him sitting by the dying fire, the baby sleeping in his arms. Sarah had asked him to hold Hope while she rested, and he'd been there for hours, afraid to move and wake her. "She trusts you," Eleanor said softly, sitting beside him. Jacob looked down at the sleeping infant, and when he spoke, his voice was steadier than it had been in months. "I had forgotten how light they are, how perfect." Eleanor reached over to touch the baby's tiny fist. "Tell me about them, your children." For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, haltingly, he began to speak. Mary was 6, looked like her mother, dark eyes, always laughing. She loved to watch me work, made tiny horseshoes from scraps. His voice caught. David was 4, quiet like me, but his hands, already showing skill. He could hold a hammer proper, strike true. The baby stirred, and Jacob adjusted his hold with remembered expertise. Their mother died when David was 2. Childbed fever. I thought that was the worst pain. I was wrong. Eleanor waited, not pushing. Raiders came while I was at the forge. I heard Mary scream. He stopped, unable to continue. After a moment, he said simply, "I was too late." "It wasn't your fault," Eleanor said firmly. "I know that here." Jacob touched his head. "But here." He placed a hand over his heart. "Here still burns." They sat in silence, watching Hope sleep, new life cradled in arms that remembered loss. "Is that why you stopped speaking?" Eleanor asked eventually. What words could matter after their voices were silenced? "I tried to build again, as you know. Town thought I was cursed, bringing death. Maybe they were right." He looked at Eleanor. "When you stood in that square, offered marriage to a caged man, I thought you were mad or desperate, but you saw something I'd forgotten existed. What? Possibility of being human again. Hope woke then, fussing until Jacob expertly soothed her with a gentle rocking motion. Watching him, Eleanor felt her heart crack open with understanding. This man had loved deeply, lost terribly, and somehow found courage to care again. When the Winters family left, the cabin felt too quiet, but something had shifted. Jacob spoke more often now. Still not easily, but the words came when needed. And that evening, he led Eleanor to the shed where he'd been working so secretly. Inside, she gasped. He'd built a cradle, beautifully crafted with carved roses along the sides and smooth rockers beneath. It was a masterpiece of woodwork, each joint perfect, the wood polished until it gleamed. I started it weeks ago, he said quietly. Didn't know why, just needed to build something beautiful again. Eleanor ran her fingers over the smooth wood, understanding the significance. This wasn't just furniture. It was hope, carved in oak and pine, a declaration that life could grow even in ground watered by tears. It's perfect, she whispered. It's yours, ours, if... He stopped, suddenly uncertain. Eleanor turned to him, seeing the question he couldn't quite voice. They'd been married for months now, sharing a bed for warmth and companionship, but nothing more. Both too damaged, too careful to presume. Jacob, she said softly, I don't know if I can carry children. After James died, there was a loss. The doctor wasn't sure. Doesn't matter, he said firmly. We've already proven family can be made other ways. The Winters, today, that was family. If children come, blessing. If not, he gestured around the shed, at the tools and works in progress. We build other things, good things, together. Eleanor felt tears threaten. This man who'd lost everything was offering her a future without conditions, without demands. Just partnership and possibility. Together, she agreed. He took her hand, the first time he'd initiated such contact, and led her back to the cabin. Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside was warmth and light and the promise of spring to come. The cradle remained in the corner, empty but waiting. Whether it would hold their own child someday or be gifted to another family in need didn't matter. What mattered was that Jacob had built it, that his hands had remembered how to create instead of just survive. That night, as they lay in their bed listening to the winter wind, Jacob spoke once more. Thank you. For what? Eleanor asked. For seeing me in that cage, for believing I could be more than what fear made me, for waiting while I remembered how to hope. Eleanor found his hand under the covers, lacing their fingers together. Thank you for proving me right. Spring arrived in the valley with a rush of snowmelt and wildflowers, painting the meadows in colors Eleanor had forgotten existed during the long winter months. She stood in the doorway of their now complete cabin, watching Jacob work with Tom Winters on a new addition, a proper workshop where Jacob could pursue his craft beyond simple repairs. The partnership between the two men had flourished over the winter months. Tom brought enthusiasm and connections to other homesteaders, while Jacob provided skill and steady determination. Together, they'd already built 3 barns and repaired countless tools for families throughout the valley. Eleanor touched the wooden beads at her throat, Jacob's winter gift to her, each bead carved with a different wildflower pattern. She'd woven them onto a leather cord and rarely took them off. They were more precious to her than any gold ring could be. Mrs. Stone, a voice called from the trail. Are you home? Sarah Winters appeared, baby Hope riding contentedly in a sling across her chest. The two women had become close friends, sharing the particular bond of those who'd weathered crisis together. Sarah, what brings you here today? Besides the chance to escape my own 4 walls? Sarah laughed. I brought something. She produced a letter from her bag. This came to the post office in Cedar Falls, addressed to you. Eleanor's heart skipped. She rarely received mail. Taking the letter with trembling hands, she recognized the legal seals immediately. What is it? Sarah asked, concerned by Eleanor's sudden pallor. It's from Ohio, from the county court. Eleanor broke the seal and read quickly, her legs growing weak. She sank onto the porch step. Eleanor, the men who killed my first husband, Eleanor said faintly. They've been arrested for another murder. The prosecutor wants me to return to testify about James's death. Says with the new evidence, they might finally get justice. Sarah sat beside her, hope gurgling contentedly between them. That's good news, isn't it? Justice at last? Eleanor looked toward the workshop where Jacob was showing Tom how to properly joint a beam. I thought I'd left that life behind. The anger, the need for revenge. I've built something here. We've built something. You don't have to go, Sarah pointed out. Don't I? Eleanor folded the letter carefully. If I don't speak for James, who will? But if I leave. She couldn't finish the thought. That evening, Eleanor showed Jacob the letter. He read it slowly. His literacy another skill that had returned with his voice. Rusty but functional. When he finished, he set it aside and took her hands. You should go, he said simply. Leave? Now? When everything is finally? James deserves justice. You deserve to see it done. His gray eyes were steady. I'll be here when you return. Come with me, Eleanor said impulsively. We could face it together. Jacob's face shuddered slightly. Eleanor, Ohio is too close to Indiana, to where... He touched the carved horse at his chest. Too many ghosts. Too many people who might remember Josiah Brennan. She understood. He'd built a new life as Jacob Stone, found peace in these mountains. Asking him to return to civilization, to risk being recognized, was too much. Then I'll stay, she decided. James is gone. What we have here is living. No, Jacob's voice was firm. You'll always wonder. Always carry the weight of unfinished business. He squeezed her hands. Go, speak your truth. Then come home. Home. The words settled between them like a promise. Eleanor left 3 days later, taking the stage from Cedar Falls. Jacob stood beside the coach, outwardly calm, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. This was the first time they'd been apart since their marriage, and neither quite knew how to say goodbye. 2 months, Eleanor said. The prosecutor says 2 months at most. Jacob nodded, then surprised her by speaking loud enough for others to hear. I'll write. You will? A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Short letters. But letters. Then, caring nothing for propriety or the watching crowd, he pulled her into an embrace. Come back, he whispered against her hair. Always, she promised. The journey to Ohio was a blur of changing coaches and landscapes that grew greener and more settled with each mile. Eleanor felt herself changing too, putting on the armor of her old life, the grieving widow seeking justice. But underneath she carried the strength of her new life like a secret talisman. The trial was harder than she'd imagined. Seeing James's killers in the dock, hearing their lawyer try to discredit her testimony, reliving that terrible day, it all threatened to pull her back into the darkness she'd escaped. But then she'd touch the wooden beads at her throat and remember, she was not the same broken woman who'd fled Ohio. She was Eleanor Stone now, who'd married a wild man and tamed a wilderness, and built a life from nothing but determination. Her testimony was clear, damning. When the verdict came back guilty, she felt no triumph, only a quiet closing of a chapter too long left unfinished. True to his word, Jacob wrote. His letters were indeed short, but each word was chosen with care. Eleanor, workshop finished. Made you a spinning wheel. Tom talks too much. I miss your bread. And you. J. Eleanor. Helped birth foal yesterday. Remembered David loved horses. Pain less sharp now. Hope you are well. J. Eleanor. Town asked me to make church bell. Said yes. Your voice would make it ring sweeter. Come home. J. She saved each letter, reading them when the press of people and memories threatened to overwhelm. And she wrote back, filling pages with all the words he couldn't yet say, painting pictures of their future with ink and hope. But the 2 months stretched to 3 as legal complications arose. When she finally boarded the westbound stage, Eleanor felt like a bird freed from a cage she'd built herself. Each mile toward Colorado lifted her spirits, each familiar landmark a promise of homecoming. It was dusk when the stage reached Cedar Falls. Eleanor expected to hire a horse for the final journey to the valley, but Jacob was there waiting, their faithful mule saddled and ready. How did you know? She asked, her voice thick with emotion. Felt it, he said simply, helping her down from the coach. Then, louder, knew you'd keep your promise. The ride home was quiet, but it was the comfortable silence of two people who'd learned to speak without words. The valley opened before them in the last light, and Eleanor saw the changes. The workshop complete, gardens planted, new fences marking boundaries of a proper homestead. But it was the cabin that made her gasp. Jacob had added windows on the eastern wall, framing the sunrise she loved. Flower boxes bloomed beneath them, and a porch wrapped around two sides, complete with the rocking chairs he'd been paid with months ago. "You've been busy," she managed. "Had to be. Empty house echoes too much." He helped her down from the mule, his hands lingering on her waist. "Was it? Did you find what you needed?" "Justice was served," Eleanor said, "but what I needed was here all along." She reached into her travel bag and pulled out her old wedding ring, the one she'd offered that day in Fallow Ridge. "I went to James's grave, left this there, told him I'd found love again. Different, but no less true. Told him I hoped he'd understand." Jacob's eyes widened. In all their months together, they'd carefully avoided naming what existed between them, as if words might break the fragile trust they'd built. "Eleanor, I know we married from necessity," she said quickly. "I know you still mourn your family. May always mourn them. But Jacob, these months apart taught me something. I don't want a marriage of convenience anymore. I want—" He silenced her with a kiss. Their first real kiss, not born of duty or proximity, but of choice and desire and love grown slowly in wounded ground. When they broke apart, Jacob reached into his pocket and drew out something wrapped in cloth. "Made this while you were gone. Couldn't focus on nothing else." It was a ring, forged from what looked like silver but gleamed differently in the fading light. As Eleanor examined it, she realized it was made from multiple metals twisted together. Iron for strength, silver for beauty, copper for warmth. "It's not gold," Jacob said uncertainly, "but it's strong. Won't break or bend. Like what we built here." Eleanor held out her hand, and he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, the weight of it solid and sure. "Now you," she said, producing a simple gold band she'd bought in Ohio. "If we're doing this proper." Jacob's hand shook slightly as she placed the ring on his finger, not the too small one from their first ceremony, but one that fit as if made for him. "Eleanor Stone," he said, voice rough with emotion. "I got no fancy words, still struggle with simple ones, but you brought me back to life, showed me how to build again, trust again, love again." He touched the carved horse at his chest, then slowly removed it, placing the leather cord around Eleanor's neck instead. "This was my past. You're my future, if you'll have me true." "I'll have you any way you come," Eleanor said through tears. Silent or speaking, broken or whole. "You're my husband, my partner, my home." They stood on their porch as stars began to appear. Two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely way. Tomorrow would bring work. Tom Winters would arrive to help with the new barn. Sarah would come for coffee and gossip. The rhythm of frontier life would continue. But tonight was theirs. Jacob lit a fire in their hearth while Eleanor unpacked, each movement a small celebration of homecoming. When she found the spinning wheel he'd made, she exclaimed with delight at its perfect craftsmanship. When he showed her the church bell waiting to be hung, she rang it softly, the clear tone carrying across the valley like a benediction. Later, as they lay in their bed watching moonlight paint patterns on the walls, Eleanor asked, "Do you ever regret it? That day in Fallow Ridge when you nodded yes to a strange woman's wild offer?" Jacob was quiet so long she thought he'd fallen asleep. Then, "Only regret is not having words then to tell you. You saved me, Eleanor. Not from the cage, from myself, from becoming the monster they thought I was." "We saved each other," Eleanor corrected. "That's what love does in hard places. It finds a way to grow." He pulled her closer, and she felt him smile against her hair. "Love," he repeated, testing the word. "Yes, love." Outside, wind sang through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, coyotes called to their kin. But inside the cabin, two people had built with their own hands. There was warmth and light and love. Not the desperate passion of youth, but the steady flame of two hearts that had learned to trust again. They'd started as strangers bound by desperation, A mail-order bride with nothing left to lose and a wild man caged by grief and misunderstanding. They'd become partners through necessity, friends through shared work, and finally, lovers through choice and time, and the thousand small kindnesses that build a life. In the morning, there would be chores and challenges and the endless work of frontier living. But they would face it together, Jacob and Eleanor Stone, proof that sometimes the most broken people can build the strongest homes, that love can grow in the rockiest soil, and that even in the harsh wilderness of the Colorado Territory, two wounded hearts can find their way to happiness. The wooden beads clicked softly as Eleanor shifted, and the carved horse rested between them. No longer a weight of sorrow, but a bridge between past and future, a reminder that some things are worth saving, worth remembering, worth carrying forward into whatever comes next. And in their corner stood the empty cradle Jacob had built, waiting with patient hope for whatever blessings time might bring. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I'd love to know where you're enjoying this tale. Are you listening while driving through mountains like our characters traveled? Or perhaps cozied up at home like Eleanor and Jacob in their cabin? Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories and responses make this journey special for all of us.